Welcome, ladies and gentlepigs, to the first installment of the best and worst of the month. I'm your cringe-worthy and socially awkward nerd of a host, Jack Fisher, aka The Screaming Fish, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the best and worst movies I saw in October 2017. Keep in mind that the films that will be featured in this video are not those featured in cinemas, and these consist of films that are already available on home video and stuff on Netflix pretty much. They are all just movies that I had the pleasure, and in some cases the displeasure, of seeing in October. And with that said, let's get started. So my first pick for Best of October is Jason Lives Friday the 13th Part 6. When most people talk about their favourite Friday the 13th movie, this is the one that often comes into conversation, and I can totally see why. But what I can't get my head around is why it took them till Part 6 to realise that this franchise actually needed some fun. This movie does not take itself seriously in the slightest. It's really dumb, but it embraces that element, and what we get as a result is one of the most entertaining slasher flicks ever made. This movie has my favourite kills in the franchise. There's some pretty suspenseful sequences as well, and I just love how it makes fun of 80s action and horror tropes. Yes, most of the characters are pretty hollow, and it's unbelievably cheesy, but it's so much fun to watch, and it's surprisingly funny, and I mean that in the best way. Unfortunately, for my worst pick, I do have to address the irony that I'm about to criticise a comedy for not even being funny, when I've just praised a slasher film of all things for being the exact opposite of that. So with that said, my first pick for Worst of October is Identity Thief. Now listen, I really like Melissa McCarthy. I think she's a really funny comedian and I enjoy a few of her movies, but Identity Thief is not one of those movies. Both Melissa McCarthy and Jason Bateman give very good performances in this film, but the story is just all over the place. First it's a movie about Jason Bateman trying to find Melissa McCarthy to get his identity back. Then it's a movie about the two of them getting chased by gang members and a bounty hunter of all things. And the list just goes on and on. The movie isn't funny in the slightest, it's just a lot of scenes of McCarthy and Bateman shouting at each other and it just becomes really annoying. The movie isn't even about what the title implies. For the majority of the first act, it's just about someone getting their identity stolen, which is what the title implies. But then the rest of the film is just one elongated, messy chase scene that just goes on for way too long. Anyway, back to positives, for my next pick for Best of October is Kill Bill Volume 2. When I first saw Kill Bill Volume 1 on Netflix, I loved it. It was such an amazing action movie with great characters, a compelling story, and the action was amazing. So when Kill Bill Volume 2 finally showed up on Netflix, I was very quick to give it a watch. I will admit, while I don't think Volume 2 flows quite as well as Volume 1 did, it was still a blast from start to finish. The action is brilliantly choreographed, Tarantino's dialogue is as good as ever, and the film offers what is probably one of the most satisfying conclusions to a character arc I've ever seen in a film. Overall, I would say that Volume 1 is the better film, but Volume 2 is still just as fun and entertaining as the first, even if it can be a little meandering in its storytelling. But now we've gone back to the worst of October, and my next pick for worst is The Babysitter. I like films that make fun of genre tropes, but only when they're done in a smart way, and The Babysitter isn't exactly what I would call a smart comedy. The performances are all very good, yes, even King Batch, and it's decently funny at times, but after what I'll admit was a pretty good first act, the film just lowers the bar drastically. The second two acts of the film are painfully rushed, and outside of the kid and one of the villains, the movie is just devoid of characterization, and the death scenes were just so stupid in the way they were executed. The movie also suffers from a lot of continuity errors and some really choppy editing that does nothing but derail the experience of what could have been a really fun movie. Next up, we're going to look at a true classic, Superman the movie. Yes, you heard that right. I did not see the original Superman until October 2017. Sue me. A lot of people will argue that this film is insanely dated beyond belief, and while they may have a point, I just couldn't help but feel a sense of joy when Christopher Reeve shows up for the first time sporting Superman's iconic costume, and his performance in the movie, both as Superman and his alter ego Clark Kent, really shows that he is the definitive Superman. That, and I just cannot get enough of Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor. His portrayal of the character put Jesse Eisenberg's hilariously bad performance as the same character in Batman v Superman to shame within the minute he appeared on screen. While the film is quite dated compared to today's standards, there are still some really intense and entertaining sequences, most notably the missile chase scene and the scene near the beginning of the film where Superman saves Lois Lane from a helicopter crash is also very good. I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I thought I would, and if you're a fan of Superman, then seriously, give this movie a watch. And now we're back to Friday the 13th! Only this time it's a bad one. The best thing I can say about this movie is that there's a really interesting side plot about the main character Tommy Jarvis dealing with psychological trauma caused by the events in the previous film, but other than that, this film is terrible. The acting from pretty much everyone in this movie, with a few exceptions, is awful. The film is supposed to be set in a farm that houses mentally disabled kids, but I don't buy any of these kids except for the main character as mentally disabled. They all just come off as the same one-dimensional horny teens from the first 3 movies, which is a huge step down from the previous installment, The Final Chapter. When characters die, I don't care because they're so underdeveloped and poorly portrayed, and they weren't even killed in cool ways. The film has some of the lamest kills in the franchise. It feels incredibly cheap and unimaginative, and the twist at the end that the killer wasn't actually Jason and someone pretending to be Jason is just so stupid. Anyway, back to the besties, and this time, of all things, it's a tennis movie, Borg vs. McEnroe. This movie kinda surprised me, because when I first saw the poster, I kinda thought, really? Biopic about a tennis match? Why? But the movie itself is so much more than that. It's a very in-depth character study about what extreme stress and pressure to live up to their title can do to a man mentally, and how a troubled background can affect the person you become in the future. Those elements made for a really interesting narrative, and this movie has what I would say is by far Shia LaBeouf's best performance of all time. He is so good in this movie, and Severe Guddazneza, I'm sorry, I cannot say his name, he is also brilliant in this film, and yeah, it is largely about the events that lead up to a tennis match, but those events are actually really interesting, and the tennis match itself is exhilarating. Before I talk about my next pick for Worst of October, I would just like to note that I do not like Adam Sandler at all. His movies, save for Happy Gilmore, Waterboy, and even the first Grown Ups movie, are all terrible. They are so unfunny, and I hate that he always gives the same performance in nearly all his movies. And this is probably his worst movie. Yes, I think this movie is worse than Jack and Jill. This movie is one of the most painfully unfunny comedies I have ever seen. Performances are horrendous, the film is filled to the brim with offensive racial stereotypes, and for the life of me, I could not figure out what the point of this movie was. Was it to say fulfill your dreams by any means necessary no matter your race or background? If so, why was it filled to the brim with racial stereotypes that A, are offensive, and B, add nothing to the story whatsoever? The filmmaking is some of the worst I've ever seen. And that's all I'm going to say about this film before I go into an hour-long rant about how awful it is. But never fear, we're back to talking about classics, and as you can tell by the very obvious poster on the screen right now, we're looking at Blade Runner. I had actually seen this film once before, but I wanted to watch it again in preparation for Blade Runner 2049, and it was just as good as I remember. No one can direct sci-fi like Ridley Scott can. Absolutely no one. All his sci-fi films have something to say, and in this case, Blade Runner is no different, because Blade Runner explores what it's like to be human, and it does that masterfully, through engaging metaphorical imagery and by showing how the world can change over time, and not always for the best. Blade Runner has some of the greatest cinematography I've ever seen in a science fiction film. Everything looks absolutely beautiful, and the action, though sparse, is really enjoyable to watch. The mystery, thriller element of the film is also very engaging. I swear Harrison Ford's Deckard could give Batman or Sherlock Holmes a run for their money, because his detective skills are on point. That, and he's just a fascinating character. The movie does have some pacing issues, but overall Blade Runner is a beautiful experience that any fan of sci-fi should watch at least once. The next movie on this list is really on here because of how disappointing it was, and not really because of how bad it was. It wasn't terrible at all, it was just really disappointing. But yeah, my next pick is The Bad Batch. I think The Bad Batch does make for an interesting take on the post-apocalyptic genre, and the characters in this movie are fantastic. But the problem here is the script. The script is very convoluted, and the way it tries to get characters from point A to point B just doesn't work. It's a shame because the film is exceptionally well made, and there's some really cool elements in this world, but the story is just so confusing, and the way it handles certain character arcs is just strange. I wish I'd liked this movie more than I did, but overall I can say that it had potential. It had a lot of potential, but it was bogged down by its messy script. And my final pick for Best of October is Spy. If, like myself, you like Melissa McCarthy, then you will love this movie just as much as I did. Paul Feig's spoof of the spy genre is one of the funniest movies I have ever seen. What this movie did with certain elements and cliches from the spy genre I thought was simply brilliant. Melissa McCarthy is at her best here. She's very witty and grounded in her performance, and it was really entertaining seeing what it would be like for someone who is essentially an IT expert having to go undercover to infiltrate this huge criminal organization. Believe me when I tell you this movie will have you laughing from the opening scene onwards. It's that funny, but the movie also wisely gives you a reason to care about the characters in this film and not just see them as quip machines, which was honestly quite refreshing to see. Also, Jason Statham is amazing in this movie. His performance is amazing, that's all I can say. That it needs to be seen to be believed. Easily the best and funniest part of the movie for me. So, folks, that there is the best and worst of October 2017. I do hope you enjoyed the first episode of this new series that I've started because of reasons. If you want to leave a comment saying what your best and worst of the month was, then please do so. But with that said, I'm Jack Fisher, aka The Screaming Fish, and I'll see you around.